Hi, I am Rachel Romeliotis, and I am a senior editor at O'Reilly Media. I am here with Emil Eifrem. He is the founder of Neo4j and the CEO of Neo Technology. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for having me.
And I also wanted to mention that you are one of the authors of a book that we are very excited about called Graph Databases, and that is what we are here
Correct.
to talk about. So why don't I start really basic and just ask you, what is a graph database?
So listen, there's been an explosion of new databases in the past couple of years, right? If you look at really the majority of the time we've been building software systems, there's really only been one dominant type of databases. Really early on, 60s, 70s, early 70s, there were multiple types of databases. There were the network database, codicil model. There were hierarchical databases. But really from, let's say, the early 80s up until just a few years ago, there's only been one type of database, the relational database. And your choice, if you're an architect or a software developer, has been, should I go with Microsoft's database, or should I go with IBM's database or Oracle's database, right? So it's been a vendor choice rather than a type of database choice. But what's happened in the past couple of years is this explosion of alternatives to the relational model. And it's been given several names, but NoSQL seems to be the name that is sticking. And there's many comments about the name, let's say, and no one thinks the name is perfect. But it is this indication that there's something going on. There's a transformation going on in the data layer of the stack, which has been largely dormant. And there are four types of NoSQL databases, and one of them is called graph databases. And really, the big thing that differentiates these different types of new databases is the so-called data model that they use. And the data model is basically the building blocks that they expose to the developer. And the building blocks of the relational database, despite the name being relational, it actually doesn't include any relationships. But the building blocks are tables. So traditional tables like Excel, rows and columns, right? The building blocks of document databases like MongoDB is document, right? The building block of a key value store like React is key and value pairs. And then the building blocks, finally, then, of a graph database is that of nodes, typed relationships between nodes, and then key value properties that you can attach to both the nodes and to the relationship. So, for example, I may be a node. You, Rachel, you're a node. Between us, there's a relationship called in a conversation right now. And this podcast may be represented by a node, and there's a relationship between the two of us and the podcast called, participant in this podcast, right? And this podcast is hosted by O'Reilly. O'Reilly is owned by Tim O'Reilly. Tim O'Reilly knows Emil Eifrem. And then you can see how that builds up a large network, or in mathematical lingo, a graph.
Wow, that was a great explanation. What are some graph database projects that people may have heard of?
That's a good question. So graph databases are probably, historically for the past few years, probably haven't been the most visible of these NoSQL databases. But recently there's been a lot of noise around graph databases. Probably the most well-known example is Facebook Graph Search. Facebook launched this, what they call the third pillar of Facebook, and it's basically a new way of searching through your social graph, and they call it Facebook Graph Search, right? So it's Graph Search it's the top bar of the web page that billions of people today use every day, right? So that's probably one of the most popular, and it's also one of the most obvious ones. A lot of people think that graph databases are great for social applications, and that's very true, because social is a graph. And I think, honestly, Mark Zuckerberg has done us in the graph database space a huge favor by popularizing the term social graph, right? Because people hear social graph, and then they hear graph database, and they see that, wow, hand glove kind of thing, right? However, there's also another story in parallel to this, which is much less well known, and that is that there's actually a very broad applicability of graph databases outside of social. So, for example, they're used in master data management inside of many of the big global 2000 today. It's used in network management by big telcos. It's used for recommendations. It's used for content management. It's used for CRM systems, etc. So there's actually a very wide range of use cases that graph databases excel in, outside of the probably most well-known one today, which is social.
Interesting. So where does Neo4j fit into this?
So Neo4j is the world's leading graph database, and I say that, and I'm biased. So dear reader, you should apply a huge grain of salt when I say that. I've worked on Neo4j now for 13 years. We started in 2000, so we are actually the original graph database. We did not coin the term. The term has been around in academic circles for a long time. But what today is sort of the conceptualization of graph databases as they're known today has been popularized by Neo4j. And by any kind of metric that we've been able to figure out, adoption, actual production customers, size of organization, etc., Neo4j is by far the leading graph database today.
Cool. So in the book, you say that the graph model shapes the data, and you touched upon this a little bit earlier in our talk, but can you go into a little bit more how it's actually doing that?
Sure. I mean, I think that's an interesting notion, right? So it turns out that data, sometimes we process new data. Customers that are using maybe MySQL start to capture new data. They have an existing system. They're storing maybe a very tabular data like a payroll system or something like that. Then all of a sudden, they want to tap into, let's use social as an example, like a social stream of data. And this is completely new data. It doesn't really fit very well in MySQL. The shape of that data is very graphy. It's very connected, which is you can definitely store that in a relational database. It's just that it's a poor fit. There's going to be friction. It's difficult to model it. You need to use joint tables, and it's a little bit awkward, and it's really, really slow. So you can put that in a graph database. So that's sort of one type of situation where people use a graph database. But another type, and when we feel like the graph model is shaping, maybe not shaping the data, but shaping how people think about the data, is when they have existing data in their relational databases. It's all stored, it's tabular, you can query according to average age in your salary module or something like that. But all of a sudden, if you take the same data and you put it in a graph database, you can see relationships between that data that you haven't seen before. For example, you may see that, hey, these people, they worked on the same project, and they were very successful in this project. So if you form a new project, you might want to put those people in this new project once again, because they are already an up and running team. Something like that is a very graphy view of that, which is not, it won't necessarily jump out and hit you on the head when you look at it from a tabular perspective. So in that way, the data tooling you use shape your data, but your thinking also shape the data tool.
Interesting. So you talked about Facebook, of course. Can you give me some other real-world examples that are in like different verticals that might be using graph databases?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can't unfortunately talk about all of the uses for Neo4j, and I really only know Neo4j. And there's a bunch of other graph databases, solid graph databases out there. But I'm really only familiar with Neo4j, so I'll speak about Neo4j specifically. There's a bunch of use cases, actually. For example, in telecommunications, Cisco is a great example. It's a big data communications company, obviously. So they use Neo4j for master data management. There's a big telco called Telenor. It's the 10th largest telco in the world, and the biggest in the Nordics, where we grew up. Neo4j grew up in Sweden. And they use us for resource authorization. Accenture is using Neo4j in a huge logistics project in Europe, actually routing parcels for one of the main countries in Europe. A very significant deployment. Deutsche Telekom, of course, Europe's biggest telco, is using Neo4j. HP is using. So there's a large variety of very big companies using graph databases today that most people haven't heard of. There's also a lot of startups using it. One example here is Glassdoor, which is right now. I'm pretty sure they're public about it. They're storing more than half of Facebook's graph in a few instances of Neo4j, which is pretty astounding if you think about it. Facebook has, I can tell you for sure, more than a few instances of their graph database running internally. And so we have some early ambitious startups storing vast amount of data in Neo4j today.
So would you say that enterprise adoption is growing by leaps and bounds?
Yeah, this is one of the things that has been surprising to us. And of course, when I write my next book, which will be my memoirs, of course, I'm going to say that I sat down in guru meditation mode and figured this all out. Of course.
Of course.
But in reality, we were actually taken by surprise. I think a very common adoption model for open source businesses, and Neo4j is open source, is that you start out in sort of the more webby, startup, hipster hacker crowd, and that's where the early adopters are. And then and then you get proven in that vertical, in that population, in that segment of the market, and then over time you branch out from there into the more mature sort of brick and mortar type, big global 2000, Fortune 500 type companies, right? That's a very traditional way. If you look at MySQL, if you look at JBoss, if you look at SpringSource, classic open source businesses today. We saw something different, which is that we did get this adoption in the webby hipster hacker startups kind of population, but simultaneously we got a lot of adoption amongst the global 2000. And I think that this speaks to the actual penicillin-like pain that graph databases solve. If you have performance problems with connected data, you don't really have any options. If you have to solve the problem, if the problem is mission critical, your alternatives typically are either use a graph database or re-implement the graph database yourself, right? And between those two, typically a big enterprise will choose to go to a vendor, right? Because I can tell from experience that writing a database is a painful experience, and if your business is to sell furniture, for example, you don't want to have a big database project, right? So given those two choices, build your own or buy off the shelf, you typically go with the vendors. I think that's the main reason why graph databases have seen a disproportionate amount of adoption inside of the enterprise compared to many other open source businesses.
So if someone were deciding whether to use a graph database, what advice would you give them? Like, what questions should they be asking themselves and steps should they be taking?
If they're considering whether a graph database is the right fit,
yes,
or once they have concluded that and want to take the next step.
Well, let's do both. Let's start with, is graph database the right fit?
Sure. So I think at that point you need to look at the use case, and you need to look at what is it that I'm building, and specifically look at the shape of the data. Am I working with data that is connected, or am I working with data that is isolated, right? So for example, people may look at a salary list, a payroll system. That's a great example of a very tabular domain, right? You have first name, last name, age, salary, title, done. That's it. Every row looks like every other row. Bam, super tabular. It's an awesome fit for a relational database. But then you may look at maybe a telecommunications network, right? Or you may look at a recommendation engine, which looks at customers who have purchased these items. Give me patterns where look at what items I have purchased. Show me people who have purchased similar items. Recommend the items that they have bought that I haven't. Right? Mm-hmm. That's a very graphy thing. Social is of course another obvious example. So if you look at that and you see that the shape of the data is very connected, then graph database is typically a better fit than many other ones.
Okay.
And at that point, of course, the next step is obvious. You buy the Graph Databases book from O'Reilly and you start reading.
Of course.
And also, I mean, I should point out that there's a lot of information online about this. So Google Graph Databases, and you'll be able to find a lot of information. We certainly have a lot of information on neo4j.org,
sure.
Which is open source. You can download it. You can get up and running for free. There's a community edition that is licensed like MySQL, so you can use it whenever you could use MySQL for free. You can use Neo4j Community for free, and you can just start hacking with it and play around with it.
So I also hear that you are going to be launching the book at the Graph Connect conferences. Tell me a little bit about that.
Awesome. You're absolutely correct. So Graph Connect is the premium conference today if you're interested in graphs and any kind of applicability of graphs and specifically graph databases, of course. And so we have, I believe, 5 Graph Connect conferences
Oh, wow.
worldwide this year. Yeah. And the first 2 are week after or next week. So basically June 10 and 11 in Boston and June 11 and 12 in Chicago. And that's when we're going to launch the book, and we're going to have a bunch of people, all the authors from the book are going to be there to sign copies. In fact, if you go to Graph Connect, you're going to get a copy of the book for free. A signed copy of the book for free.
Awesome.
To go to the conference. Yeah. And then there's going to be a bunch of users there talking about how they're using graph databases and Neo4j roadmap and other awesome topics about graph databases.
Well, that's great. Now, one final question. Where do you see graph databases in 5 years, 10 years down the line?
That's a great question. It's a favorite of mine. So I think graph databases right now in 2013, they're in a very interesting spot, right? So even a year ago, most geeks had not even heard of graph databases. They didn't know that they existed, right? And let's not kid ourselves, right? I mean, most people even today, have not heard of graph databases. But if you look at early adopters, the typical people who are, let's say, passionate about their industry, they read O'Reilly books, they go to conferences, etc. They have heard of graph databases today, and that's a vast difference from even a year ago. Now graph databases, however, are in the sort of fascinating spot where they're sort of pigeonholed into social. So people think that they're only useful for social, which is actually, that was a little bit frustrating to me because I see the wide horizontal applicability of graph databases for a while. But now I actually think it's a good thing. It's great that people at least clearly associate one use case with this category of products, right? But I have a fortunate position that I have a surplus of information about the usage of graph databases, and I see that it is used very much across the field. So I think 5 years from now, it's going to be very obvious that graph databases are a horizontal solution, and they're actually more generic even than document databases, which is today is the most, I think, popular type of NoSQL database. And I think that in terms of the data model, it is as generic as the relational model. And so I think the ultimate potential of graph databases is as big or bigger than the relational model. So 5 years from now, I think graph database is going to be one of the most widely deployed databases out there and be strongly marching towards becoming the most popular database type on the planet.
I think that you are right. I'm going to side with you on that one.
Awesome. Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Let's see if you're right.
Yeah, we will. So thank you very much for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. And good luck with the book. I know it's going to be amazing.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.